In the heart of Pine Hollow Forest, the sun was slowly setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Frank Matthews, a dog lover and long-distance truck driver, was on a journey to visit his mother in the neighboring state. The winding road through the dense forest was a familiar route, one he had traveled countless times before. But this evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew crisp, something unusual caught his eye. A robust brown silhouette appeared in front of him, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. Frank squinted through the windshield, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. As he drew closer, the shape materialized into a Labrador, its coat a rich chocolate color that seemed to absorb the fading sunlight. Frank's foot instinctively eased off the accelerator. He was a man who believed in signs, and something about this lone dog in the wilderness spoke to him. The Labrador's gait was steady but hesitant, its head swiveling from side to side as if searching for something or someone. Pulling over to the shoulder of the road, Frank killed the engine and stepped out of his truck. The forest air hit him immediately, a mixture of pine and damp earth that filled his lungs. He called out softly, "Hey there, buddy. You lost?" The dog's ears perked up at the sound of Frank's voice, and it turned to face him. In that moment, Frank's heart clenched. The Labrador's eyes were a deep, soulful brown, filled with a mixture of curiosity and sadness that seemed almost human. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something else, a plea for help that Frank couldn't ignore. "It's okay," Frank murmured, slowly approaching the dog with his hand outstretched. "I'm not going to hurt you." The Labrador watched him warily but didn't run. As Frank drew closer, he could see that the dog's coat was matted in places, twigs and burrs caught in its fur. This wasn't someone's pampered pet, this dog had been on its own for a while. A quick glance at his watch told Frank he was already running late for his visit. His mother, Ellen, would be worried if he didn't show up soon. But as he looked back at the dog, standing alone amidst the towering pines, Frank knew he couldn't just drive away. "What's your story, Herr?" he asked softly, now close enough to reach out and touch the dog. The Labrador's tail gave a hesitant wag, and Frank felt a surge of warmth in his chest. "Where did you come from?" As if in response, the dog turned and took a few steps into the forest, then looked back at Frank expectantly. It was clear as day the dog wanted him to follow. Frank hesitated, glancing back at his truck. The sensible thing would be to call animal control, let them handle this. But something in the dog's eyes, that mix of intelligence and desperation, tugged at him. This wasn't just a lost pet, there was a story here, one that Frank felt compelled to uncover. With a deep breath, Frank made his decision. He reached into his truck, grabbed a flashlight and his phone, and locked the door. "All right, buddy," he said to the dog. "Lead the way." As Frank took his first steps into the forest, following the brown Labrador, he felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The trees seemed to close in around him, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The dog moved with purpose now, occasionally looking back to ensure Frank was still following. The promise of an emotional journey hung in the air, as tangible as the mist that was starting to form between the trees. Frank's heart raced with anticipation and a touch of fear. He was stepping into the unknown, guided by a mysterious canine companion, and he had no idea where this adventure would lead him. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of the highway faded away, replaced by the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. Frank's mind raced with questions. Who did this dog belong to? Why was it out here alone? And most importantly, what was it trying to show him? Little did Frank know that this chance encounter in the fading light of day was about to change his life forever. The emotional journey that lay ahead would test his courage, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary bonds that can form between humans and animals in the face of adversity. As Frank delved deeper into the forest, following the mysterious Labrador, the environment around him began to shift dramatically. The once comforting sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves gradually faded into a distant echo, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the air. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Frank's footsteps, muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves, seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing some invisible threshold, leaving the familiar world behind and entering a realm where the usual rules didn't apply. The dog, which he had mentally started calling Buddy, moved with increasing urgency, as if aware of Frank's growing unease. "Hey, slow down a bit," Frank called out, his voice sounding strangely flat in the dense air. Buddy turned to look at him, and in that moment, as a shaft of fading sunlight pierced through the canopy, Frank noticed something glinting on the dog's collar. Curiosity piqued, Frank quickened his pace to catch up with Buddy. As he drew closer, his heart began to race. What he had initially mistaken for a simple dog tag was actually something far more unusual, a small electronic device, securely attached to Buddy's collar. "What's this you've got here, boy?" Frank murmured, kneeling down beside the Labrador. Buddy sat patiently, allowing Frank to examine the device. With trembling fingers, Frank carefully turned it over in his hands. It was a voice recorder, compact and weatherproof, clearly designed to withstand the elements. A chill ran down Frank's spine as his mind raced with possibilities. Why would someone attach a recording device to a dog's collar? Was Buddy part of some kind of experiment? Or was there a more sinister explanation? As if sensing Frank's distress, Buddy whined softly and nuzzled his hand. The gesture of comfort only served to heighten Frank's anxiety. He found himself recalling snippets of conversation he'd overheard at truck stops and diners along his regular routes. Whispered stories of children going missing in these parts, urban legends that had circulated through the nearby towns for years. Frank had always dismissed such tales as nothing more than small-town gossip, the kind of stories people told to make their quiet lives seem more exciting. But now, standing in the deepening gloom of the forest with a mysterious dog wearing a recording device, those stories took on a chilling new significance. "What have you seen, Buddy?" Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "What secrets are you carrying?" With hands that shook slightly, Frank examined the recorder more closely. There was a small play button on the side, tempting him. Should he listen to whatever was recorded? Or would that be an invasion of privacy, assuming the device belonged to Buddy's rightful owner? After a moment's hesitation, curiosity won out. Frank pressed the play button, holding his breath as he waited for the recording to start. At first, there was nothing but static and the muffled sounds of movement, probably Buddy running through the forest. But then, faintly, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's voice, distant but distinct, calling for help. Frank's mind reeled. The recording was brief and unclear, but there was no mistaking the fear in that young voice. He played it again, straining to hear any other details that might give him a clue about what was going on. But there was nothing else, just that haunting cry for help, then more static. Looking at Buddy, Frank saw the dog in a new light. Was this loyal animal trying to lead him to a child in danger? Or was there an even more complex story at play here? Frank's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling in the underbrush nearby. Buddy's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Frank froze, his eyes scanning the darkening forest around them. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, just as Frank was about to convince himself it was just the wind, he saw a shadow dart between two distant trees. "Hello," Frank called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" No response came, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to return to the safety of his truck and the familiar highway beyond. But the memory of that child's voice on the recording steeled his resolve. If there was even a chance that a kid was in trouble out here, he couldn't just walk away. Frank had never considered himself a hero, he was just a regular guy, a truck driver who loved dogs and missed his mom's cooking. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. "Okay, Buddy," Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I guess we're in this together now. Show me where we need to go." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Buddy's demeanor changed. The dog stood straighter, its gaze focused and alert. With a soft woof, Buddy turned and began to trot deeper into the forest, occasionally looking back to make sure Frank was following. They walked for what felt like hours, though Frank's watch told him it had only been about 45 minutes. The forest grew darker and more forbidding with each step. Gnarled roots seemed to reach out to trip him, and more than once, Frank thought he heard whispers on the wind, though whether they were real or just his imagination playing tricks on him, he couldn't say. As they pressed on, Frank's mind wandered to the stories he'd heard about these woods. There were tales of an old hermit who lived deep in the forest, a man who had turned his back on society decades ago. Some said he was harmless, just a lonely soul seeking solitude. Others painted a darker picture, suggesting he lured people into the woods, never to be seen again. Frank had always scoffed at such stories, but now, with each shadow seeming to hide a potential threat, those tales didn't seem so far-fetched. He found himself jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves. Buddy, however, remained focused, leading Frank onward with unwavering determination. Just as Frank was beginning to wonder how much further they could go, Buddy stopped abruptly. The dog's ears were pricked forward, its body tense. Frank strained his eyes, trying to see what had caught Buddy's attention. At first, he saw nothing but more trees and shadows. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat, a faint light, flickering in the distance. "What is that, Buddy?" Frank whispered, though he knew the dog couldn't answer. The light seemed to be coming from a structure of some kind, perhaps a cabin or a shack, hidden deep in the woods where no building should be. As they drew closer, Frank could make out more details. It was indeed a cabin, old and weathered, its windows glowing with a soft, yellowish light. The sight should have been comforting, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. Instead, it filled Frank with a sense of foreboding. Buddy whined softly, pawing at the ground. The dog seemed conflicted, as if it both wanted to approach the cabin and flee from it at the same time. Frank understood the feeling all too well. Standing at the edge of the small clearing where the cabin stood, Frank faced a decision. Should he approach the building, potentially putting himself in danger? Or should he turn back now, call the authorities, and let them handle whatever was going on here? As he weighed his options, a sound drifted from the cabin, faint, but unmistakable. It was a child's voice, the same one he had heard on the recording. And this time, there was no mistaking the fear and desperation in that young voice. In that moment, Frank knew he couldn't walk away. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever secrets this forest held, he had to see this through. With a deep breath, he patted Buddy's head and whispered, "All right, boy. Let's go see what's going on in there." Together, man and dog stepped out of the shadows and into the clearing, moving towards the cabin and whatever fate awaited them inside. As Frank and Buddy moved away from the road and deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The towering pines seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, obscuring what little remained of the fading daylight. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying with it the musty scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Frank's footsteps crunched loudly on the forest floor, each sound seeming to echo unnaturally in the eerie stillness. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, unseen eyes following their every move from the shadows. Buddy, who had initially appeared friendly and eager for companionship, began to exhibit strange behaviors that set Frank's nerves on edge. The Labrador's demeanor shifted subtly at first. Its tail, which had been wagging tentatively, now hung low and stiff. The dog's ears, once perked up attentively, flattened against its head. But it was the change in Buddy's eyes that truly unnerved Frank. The warm, soulful gaze that had initially drawn him in was replaced by something wild and unpredictable, a look that spoke of secrets and hidden dangers. "Easy there, Buddy," Frank murmured, trying to keep his voice calm and steady despite the growing knot of fear in his stomach. "What's got you so worked up, boy?" As if in response to Frank's words, Buddy let out a low, rumbling growl. The sound sent a shiver down Frank's spine. He had been around dogs all his life, had always felt a kinship with them, but this was different. There was something almost unnatural about the way Buddy was acting. Frank took a tentative step towards the dog, his hand outstretched in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "It's okay, we're friends, remember? I'm here to help." But with each step Frank took, Buddy's posture grew more aggressive. The dog's hackles raised, lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. It was as if Buddy was guarding something, protecting a dark secret that lay hidden in the depths of the forest. A cold sweat broke out on Frank's forehead as realization dawned. He was alone in the wilderness, far from help, with a potentially dangerous animal. The weight of his decision to follow Buddy into the forest suddenly felt like a lead blanket on his shoulders. What had he been thinking, abandoning the safety of his truck to chase after a stray dog? "Okay, Buddy," Frank said, his voice shaking slightly. "I think maybe it's time I headed back. You take care of yourself, all right?" He began to back away slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. But as he retreated, Buddy advanced. Each backward step Frank took matched by a forward stride from the dog. The growling intensified, a constant, menacing rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. Frank's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He tried to remember everything he'd ever learned about dealing with aggressive dogs, but his mind was blank with panic. All he could focus on was the predatory gleam in Buddy's eyes, the tensed muscles visible beneath the dog's brown coat. "Nice doggy," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "Good boy, just stay there." But Buddy wasn't listening. With a snarl that seemed to split the air, the Labrador lunged forward. Frank's survival instincts kicked in, overriding his shock and fear. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes, but Frank barely noticed. All he could hear was the sound of Buddy's pursuit behind him, paws pounding the earth, jaws snapping at his heels. The forest blurred around him as he ran, his lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. In his panic, Frank lost all sense of direction. He had no idea if he was running deeper into the forest or back towards the road. All that mattered was putting distance between himself and the suddenly vicious dog that was chasing him. As he ran, Frank's mind raced with questions. What had happened to turn Buddy from a seemingly friendly stray into this snarling beast? Was it something Frank had done? Or was there something more sinister at play here, something connected to the strange recording device and the tales of missing children? Frank's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling to the ground. He hit the forest floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. Then he heard it, the sound of Buddy's approaching growl. Scrambling to his feet, Frank looked around wildly for something, anything he could use to defend himself. His eyes fell on a fallen branch, thick and sturdy. He snatched it up, wielding it like a club as he turned to face his pursuer. Buddy burst through the underbrush, teeth bared, eyes wild. Frank raised the branch, ready to swing, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. But at the last moment, something made him hesitate. In that split second before Buddy reached him, Frank saw something in the dog's eyes. It wasn't just aggression or wildness, there was fear there too. And something else, a pleading look, as if the dog was trying to communicate something vitally important. Frank's hesitation cost him. Buddy slammed into him, knocking him back to the ground. The branch flew from Frank's grasp, landing just out of reach. He raised his arms to protect his face, bracing for the feel of teeth tearing into his flesh. But the attack never came. Instead, Frank felt a wet nose pressing insistently against his hand, followed by a whine that sounded almost apologetic. Cautiously, Frank lowered his arms. Buddy stood over him, tail tucked between his legs, all signs of aggression gone. The dog whined again, then gently took Frank's sleeve between its teeth, tugging insistently. "What the hell?" Frank muttered, his voice hoarse from fear and exertion. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. Buddy released his sleeve and backed up a few steps, then turned and looked over its shoulder, clearly wanting Frank to follow. Frank's mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One moment Buddy had been chasing him like a thing possessed, the next acting like a trained guide dog. It was as if the Labrador was two different animals, switching between them in the blink of an eye. As his panic subsided, Frank became aware of his surroundings once more. The forest had changed during his frantic flight. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and gnarled with age. The underbrush was thinner, the ground covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled all sound. And there, barely visible through the trees ahead, was a flicker of light. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He remembered the cabin he had glimpsed earlier, before Buddy's strange behavior had sent him running. Was that where the dog had been trying to lead him all along? Buddy whined again, more urgently this time. The dog took a few steps towards the light, then looked back at Frank expectantly. For a long moment, Frank remained where he was, his mind and body both exhausted from the chase. Every instinct told him to turn back, to find his way to the road and his truck, to put this strange and terrifying experience behind him. But then he remembered the recording he had heard on Buddy's collar. The child's voice, crying for help. Whatever was going on here, whatever secrets this forest held, there was a chance that someone's life was at stake. With a groan, Frank pushed himself to his feet. His legs shook, muscles trembling from the strain of his panicked flight. But he forced himself to stand tall, to meet Buddy's gaze with determination. "All right," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I don't know what game you're playing, Buddy, but I'm trusting you. Lead the way." Buddy's tail gave a single, tentative wag. Then, with a soft woof, the dog turned and began to trot towards the distant light. Frank followed, his steps cautious but resolute. As they moved through the ancient forest, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could imagine. But he also felt a sense of purpose, a determination to see this through to the end, whatever that might be. The light grew brighter as they approached, resolving into the warm glow of windows. Soon, Frank could make out the shape of the cabin, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. Buddy stopped at the edge of a small clearing, looking back at Frank with an unreadable expression. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped out of the shelter of the trees. Whatever awaited him in that cabin, he was ready to face it. Or so he hoped. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the weathered cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, eerie light. The sound of dry leaves crunching beneath his feet seemed deafening in the oppressive silence of the forest. Buddy, the enigmatic Labrador, stayed close to his side, the dog's earlier aggression replaced by an anxious vigilance. As they drew nearer, Frank could make out more details of the structure. The cabin was old, its wooden planks warped and grayed with age. Moss and ivy clung to the walls, as if nature was slowly reclaiming the building. The porch sagged slightly, and the steps creaked ominously under Frank's weight as he climbed them. Frank paused at the door, his hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob. He could hear faint sounds from within, a shuffle of movement, a muffled whimper. The memory of the child's voice from the recording flashed through his mind, stealing his resolve. With a deep breath, Frank grasped the doorknob and turned it. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. The door swung open with a drawn-out groan, revealing the cabin's dimly lit interior. The smell hit him first, a musty, dank odor tinged with something unpleasantly sweet. Frank's eyes watered as he stepped inside, Buddy close at his heels. As his vision adjusted to the gloom, he took in his surroundings. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with a rickety table, a couple of chairs, and a threadbare cot in the corner. A kerosene lamp on the table provided the only illumination, its flame flickering and casting long shadows across the walls. But it was what Frank saw in the far corner that made his blood run cold. Huddled there, knees drawn up to her chest, was a small figure, a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. "Oh my God," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible even in the stillness of the cabin. The girl's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes wide with fear. She shrank back further into the corner, as if trying to melt into the wall itself. Frank's mind raced. He had hoped, desperately, that the voice on the recording had been some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But here was undeniable proof that something sinister was indeed happening in these woods. He took a cautious step towards the girl, his hands held out in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." The girl's gaze darted between Frank and Buddy, her expression a mix of hope and suspicion. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, remaining silent. Frank's heart ached at the sight of her. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her hair matted and tangled. There were scratches on her arms and face, as if she had been running through thorny underbrush. "My name's Frank," he continued, keeping his voice low and gentle. "What's your name, sweetheart?" For a long moment, the girl said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "Emily." "Emily," Frank repeated, offering a small smile. "That's a pretty name." Can you tell me how you got here, Emily? Before the girl could answer, a sound outside the cabin made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the crack of twigs and rustle of leaves. Panic surged through Frank. Someone was coming, likely whoever was responsible for Emily's presence here. He had to act fast. Emily, he whispered urgently, we need to hide. Can you do that for me? The girl nodded, her eyes wide with renewed fear. Frank quickly scanned the room, his gaze settling on a large wooden chest near the cot. Over there, he said, pointing. Quickly and quietly. As Emily scurried towards the chest, Frank turned to Buddy. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, its ears perked and alert. You too, boy, Frank murmured, guiding the Labrador towards the hiding spot. Frank helped Emily into the chest, then ushered Buddy in after her. Stay very quiet, he instructed, his voice barely audible. I'll come get you when it's safe. With trembling hands, he closed the lid of the chest, leaving it open just a crack to allow air in. Then, hearing the footsteps now on the porch, Frank looked around frantically for a hiding place of his own. The space under the cot was too small, and there was nowhere else that could conceal a grown man. In a split-second decision, Frank positioned himself behind the door just as it began to open. The newcomer entered slowly, cautiously. From his hidden position, Frank could only see a pair of muddy boots and the hem of a long coat. The figure moved further into the room, and Frank held his breath, pressing himself as flat against the wall as possible. Where are you, little one? A gruff voice called out, sending chills down Frank's spine. Come out, wherever you are. The man, for the voice was unmistakably male, moved towards the corner where Emily had been huddled earlier. Frank saw his chance. With his heart in his throat, he lunged forward, slamming the door shut and throwing the bolt. The intruder whirled around, his face a mask of shock and rage. He was a large man, unkempt and wild-looking, with a tangled beard and eyes that glittered with malice. Who the hell are you? The man snarled, advancing on Frank. Frank backed away, his mind racing. He was trapped in a small cabin with a potentially dangerous individual, with an innocent child and a dog hidden just feet away. The situation couldn't be more precarious. I'm just a traveler, Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady. I got lost in the woods and found this cabin. I thought it was abandoned. The man's eyes narrowed suspiciously. You're lying, he growled. You're here for the girl, aren't you? Well, you can't have her. She's mine. Frank's blood boiled at the man's words, but he forced himself to remain calm. He needed to find a way out of this situation, to get Emily to safety. Look, Frank said, holding up his hands placatingly, I don't want any trouble. Why don't we both just walk away from this? You go your way, I'll go mine. The man laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Oh, it's far too late for that, he sneered. You've seen too much. I can't let you leave. With surprising speed for his size, the man lunged at Frank. They grappled, crashing into the rickety table and sending the kerosene lamp flying. It shattered on the floor, flames quickly spreading across the dry wooden planks. As they struggled, Frank's hand closed around something solid, one of the chairs. With all his strength, he swung it at his attacker's head. There was a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the floor. Frank stood there for a moment, panting heavily, the adrenaline surging through his veins. Then the reality of their situation hit him. The cabin was on fire, and they needed to get out immediately. He rushed to the chest, throwing open the lid. Emily, Buddy, come on, he shouted over the roar of the flames. We need to go now. Emily scrambled out, coughing from the thickening smoke. Buddy followed, whining anxiously. Frank scooped Emily up in his arms and made for the door, the dog at his heels. They burst out of the burning cabin into the cool night air. Frank didn't stop running until they were a safe distance away, the orange glow of the fire casting long shadows through the trees. Setting Emily down gently, Frank pulled out his phone with shaking hands. To his immense relief, he had a signal. He dialed 911, his voice cracking as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. As they waited for help to arrive, Frank held Emily close, Buddy curled up protectively at their feet. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but they were safe for now. Frank silently vowed to see this through to the end, to make sure Emily got home safely and that whoever was responsible for her ordeal faced justice. The sound of distant sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing moment. Help was on the way. As the flashing lights appeared through the trees, Frank felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the wail of sirens grew louder, piercing through the oppressive silence of the forest, Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him. He held Emily close, her small frame trembling against his chest, while Buddy stood vigilant at their feet, ears perked towards the approaching sound of help. The flashing red and blue lights finally broke through the dense foliage, illuminating the clearing where Frank, Emily, and Buddy waited. 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop, kicking up leaves and dirt. Close behind them, an ambulance maneuvered carefully through the narrow forest path. Officers poured out of the vehicles, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons as they took in the scene: a burning cabin, a disheveled man holding a frightened child, and a protective Labrador. Frank raised one hand slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "It's okay," he called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "We're the ones who called. The girl, she needs help." A female officer approached cautiously, her eyes darting between Frank and Emily. "Sir, I need you to put the child down and step away slowly," she instructed, her tone firm but not unkind. Frank nodded, gently setting Emily on her feet. As soon as he let go, Buddy moved closer to the girl, as if to offer comfort and protection. The sight brought a lump to Frank's throat. Paramedics rushed forward to attend to Emily, wrapping her in a shock blanket and beginning a preliminary examination. Frank watched anxiously as they worked, answering the barrage of questions from the officers surrounding him. "Can you tell us exactly what happened here, sir?" the female officer, who had introduced herself as Detective Sarah Martinez, asked. Frank took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the evening: his chance encounter with Buddy, the strange recording device, the chase through the woods, and finally, the discovery of Emily and the confrontation in the cabin. As he spoke, Frank could see the disbelief and then the growing concern on Detective Martinez's face. She listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. "And the man who had Emily," Martinez pressed, "where is he now?" Frank's stomach churned as he remembered the struggle in the cabin. He was still inside when the fire started. "I hit him with a chair, and he went down. I don't know if..." His voice trailed off, the implications of his actions suddenly hitting him full force. Martinez nodded grimly, turning to confer with her colleagues. Frank overheard snippets of their conversation: "Search the area, possible accomplices, forensic team." As the police began to organize a thorough search of the surrounding forest, Frank's attention was drawn back to Emily. The paramedics had finished their initial assessment and were preparing to transport her to the hospital. As they guided her towards the ambulance, Emily suddenly broke away, running back to Frank and throwing her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. Frank felt tears prick at his eyes as he returned the hug, careful not to squeeze too tight. "You're safe now, Emily," he murmured. "Everything's going to be okay." As Emily was gently led away, Detective Martinez approached Frank again. Her expression was softer now, tinged with something that looked like respect. "Mr. Matthews," she began, "I know this has been a traumatic experience, but we need you to come to the station to give a formal statement." "Anne." She hesitated, her eyes dropping to Buddy, who sat loyally at Frank's feet. "We'll need to take the dog as evidence." Frank felt a pang of protectiveness. Evidence? But Buddy helped save Emily. He led me to her. Martinez nodded understandingly. "I believe you, Mr. Matthews. But that recording device on his collar could be crucial evidence in this case. We need to analyze it thoroughly." Frank knelt down beside Buddy, running his hand through the dog's fur. "You hear that, boy? These nice officers are going to take care of you for a while. But I promise I'll come see you as soon as I can, okay?" Buddy whined softly, nuzzling Frank's hand. As a young officer approached with a leash, Frank felt a lump form in his throat. He watched as Buddy was gently led away, the dog looking back at him with those soulful brown eyes. The ride to the police station was a blur. Frank's mind raced, replaying the events of the evening over and over. He answered questions on autopilot, providing as much detail as he could remember about the cabin, the kidnapper, and every step of his journey through the woods. Hours passed in the Stark interview room. Frank's throat was raw from talking, his eyes burning with exhaustion. Just as he thought he couldn't take any more, the door opened, and Detective Martinez entered, a small smile on her face. "Mr. Matthews," she said, taking a seat across from him, "I have some news. First, Emily is safe at the hospital. She's dehydrated and a bit malnourished, but otherwise unharmed. Her parents are with her now." Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank God," he murmured. Martinez continued, her expression turning serious. "We've also made some disturbing discoveries. The man you encountered in the cabin? He didn't make it out of the fire. But we've identified him as Joseph Crawley, a suspect in several child abduction cases across 3 states. Frank's mind reeled at this information. The gravity of what he had stumbled into was starting to sink in. "There's more," Martinez said, her voice low. "We've analyzed the recording device from the dog's collar. It seems Crawley was using trained dogs to lure children into the woods. The recorder would play a child's voice asking for help, drawing kids away from safety." A wave of nausea washed over Frank as he processed this information. He thought of Buddy, of how close he had come to dismissing the dog as just a stray. If he had driven on, ignored that nagging feeling. "But Buddy, he led me to Emily," Frank said, confusion evident in his voice. "He didn't act like he was working with Crawley." Martinez nodded. "That's the interesting part. From what we can tell, this dog, Buddy, as you call him, seems to have turned on Crawley. Instead of luring children, he was trying to lead adults to the cabin. We found evidence of him approaching several hikers and campers in the area over the past week." Frank felt a surge of pride for Buddy. Somehow, the loyal Labrador had overcome his training, working to save the very children he had been taught to endanger. "What happens now?" Frank asked, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Well, Mr. Matthews, you've helped us crack open a case that's baffled law enforcement for years," Martinez replied. "There will be more questions, of course. We'll need to investigate if Crawley had any accomplices, search for any other potential victims. But for now," she smiled, standing up, "I think you've earned some rest." As Frank was led out of the interview room, he caught sight of a familiar furry face. Buddy was there, sitting patiently beside a young officer's desk. The dog's tail began to wag furiously as soon as he saw Frank. "Hey there, boy," Frank said, kneeling down to ruffle Buddy's ears. "Looks like we both had quite an adventure, huh?" Detective Martinez watched the reunion with a small smile. "You know," she said, "once the investigation is complete, Buddy here will need a home. Given the circumstances, I think we could arrange for you to adopt him, if you're interested." Frank looked up at her, then back at Buddy, who was gazing at him with those soulful brown eyes. In that moment, despite the trauma and exhaustion of the past hours, Frank felt a warmth spread through his chest. "What do you say, Buddy?" he asked softly. "Want to come home with me?" Buddy's enthusiastic bark echoed through the station, drawing smiles from the officers around them. As Frank stood, his new companion at his side, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The nightmare in the woods was over, but a new journey was just beginning, one of healing, of justice, and of an unbreakable bond forged in the face of darkness. The weeks following the harrowing events in Pine Hollow Forest unfolded in a whirlwind of police interviews, media attention, and emotional reunions. Frank Matthews, once an ordinary truck driver, found himself thrust into the spotlight as the unlikely hero who had cracked open a years-long child abduction case. As the dust began to settle, Frank sat in his modest apartment, Buddy curled up at his feet. The loyal Labrador had become a constant presence in his life, a living reminder of the incredible journey they had shared. Frank's fingers absently stroked Buddy's soft fur as he reflected on the profound changes that had occurred since that fateful evening. The investigation into Joseph Crawley's activities had revealed a network of criminal activity that spanned multiple states. Detective Martinez and her team had worked tirelessly, following leads and uncovering evidence that linked Crawley to at least 5 other child abductions. The discovery of the trained dogs and their recording devices had sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles, prompting a re-evaluation of search and rescue protocols in forested areas. Frank's phone buzzed, pulling him from his reverie. It was a text from Emily's parents, sharing a photo of their daughter smiling brightly at her welcome home party. The sight brought a lump to Frank's throat. Emily's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Though she still had a long road ahead in terms of psychological healing, her resilience was inspiring. As Frank set his phone down, his gaze fell on the stack of letters on his coffee table. Since the story had broken, he had received hundreds of messages from people across the country. Some were from parents of missing children, thanking him for renewing their hope. Others were from fellow truckers, expressing pride in one of their own stepping up in such a monumental way. But it was the letter on top of the pile that truly captured Frank's attention. It was from a renowned animal behaviorist who had been studying Buddy's case. The expert's findings had shed new light on the complex relationship between humans and animals, particularly in high-stress situations. According to the behaviorist, Buddy's decision to turn against his training and seek help was a remarkable example of canine cognitive dissonance. The dog had essentially chosen empathy over conditioning, a choice that challenged many existing theories about animal behavior. This discovery had opened up new avenues of research in the field of animal psychology, with potential implications for therapy animals and search and rescue dogs. Frank smiled as he watched Buddy doze peacefully. The once instrument of a sinister plot had become a symbol of hope and redemption. Buddy's story had captured hearts nationwide, inspiring a surge of adoptions at local animal shelters. People were drawn to the idea that even animals with traumatic pasts could become heroes given the right circumstances and a little love. A knock at the door roused both Frank and Buddy from their quiet moment. Frank opened it to find Detective Martinez standing in the hallway, a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Matthews," she greeted him, "may I come in? There have been some developments in the case that I think you should be aware of." Frank nodded, ushering her inside. As they settled in the living room, Buddy positioned himself between them, ever the vigilant protector. "We've made a breakthrough," Martinez began, her voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Based on evidence found in Crawley's cabin and information gathered from Buddy's recording device, we've identified a potential accomplice." Frank leaned forward, his heart racing. "An accomplice? I thought Crawley worked alone." Martinez shook her head. "We did too, initially. But as we dug deeper, we found traces of someone else's involvement. Someone who may have been supplying Crawley with the trained dogs." The implications of this revelation hit Frank like a tidal wave. If there was an accomplice still out there, it meant the threat wasn't entirely neutralized. Children could still be in danger. "What can I do to help?" Frank asked without hesitation. Martinez smiled, though her eyes remained serious. "I was hoping you'd say that. We believe the accomplice might try to make contact with you, given your high profile in the media right now. We'd like your permission to monitor your communications and potentially use you as bait to draw them out." Frank felt a mixture of fear and determination wash over him. The thought of putting himself in the crosshairs of a potentially dangerous criminal was terrifying, but the memory of Emily's grateful embrace steeled his resolve. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes to make sure no other kids go through what Emily did." As Detective Martinez outlined the details of the operation, Frank's mind wandered to the future. He thought about the long drives ahead, the open road stretching out before him. But now, instead of solitude, he'd have Buddy by his side. The cab of his truck, once a space of lonely contemplation, would be filled with the warmth of companionship. The next few months were a delicate dance of vigilance and patience. Frank went about his routines, making his usual long-haul trips, but now every interaction was scrutinized, every unusual occurrence reported back to Martinez and her team. Buddy became not just a pet, but a partner in this covert operation, his keen senses often picking up on things Frank might have missed. It was on a crisp autumn morning, as Frank was loading up his truck for a cross-country haul, that the breakthrough came. A nondescript man approached, asking if Frank was interested in buying a trained dog. The man's casual demeanor belied the calculated look in his eyes, a look that sent a chill down Frank's spine. With his heart pounding, Frank engaged the man in conversation, carefully using the code phrases Martinez had drilled into him. As they talked, Frank could see the police closing in, their movements subtle but purposeful. The arrest was swift and efficient. The man, caught off guard, barely had time to resist before he was in handcuffs. As he was led away, Frank caught a glimpse of relief in the suspect's eyes, as if a great weight had been lifted. In the aftermath of the arrest, the full extent of the operation was revealed. The accomplice had been running a sophisticated dog training facility, churning out animals conditioned to assist in abductions. The bust led to the rescue of dozens of dogs and, more importantly, provided crucial information that helped locate several missing children. As Frank watched the news coverage of the families being reunited, he felt a profound sense of closure. The nightmare that had begun on that fateful evening in Pine Hollow Forest was finally, truly over. Sitting on the porch of his new home, a cozy cabin on the outskirts of town, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Buddy lay at his feet, grey now around the muzzle but still alert and loyal as ever. The years had brought changes. Frank had retired from long-haul trucking, instead focusing on local deliveries and volunteering with search and rescue operations. His experiences had given him a unique perspective that proved invaluable in training both handlers and dogs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink reminiscent of that life-changing evening, Frank felt a deep sense of peace. The path that had led him here had been fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it had also been filled with courage, compassion, and an unbreakable bond between man and dog. Buddy lifted his head, meeting Frank's gaze with those soulful brown eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the forest, Frank knew that sometimes the greatest adventures, and the most profound transformations, begin with a single act of kindness towards a lonely dog on a darkening road.